Hey guys, thank you for joining me on this topic. I wanted to start with, we thought about diversity in tech. I started mentioning people I'm going to have this conversation because, I kind of don't want to talk about that topic. I have a role at an organization. I built this company. That's what I want to talk about today. So I'm kind of curious to hear from both of you. Did either of you hesitate when I asked you to join me up here? And you're obviously here. So why do you think it's important to talk about diversity in the tech industry today? You want to go first, Eddie? Go ahead.
Happy to. I admit I hesitated. And that's because there's a lot of talk about diversity in tech, but not a whole lot of progress. So we're here talking some more. And ultimately, I got really excited to be here because I really believe that the way we approach diversity is going to shape the future of technology. When you talk to CEOs, founders, people in positions of power in tech, they're really concerned about their public trust and moral leadership, right? These are the real issues of the industry. It's not enough anymore to just build valuable companies. We have to build good companies. Not only that, but employees are actually demanding this from their leaders. Right? So they want to work at companies that create meaning in their life. They want to not just do interesting work, but they're looking for communities that support where they belong, and they're inspired to be their best selves. Aside from that, it's also a competitive issue. So if you're in tech, the landscape changes so quickly that really talent is the only way to stay ahead 5 or 10 years down the line. So if you don't have a place that diverse folks want to work, and those people can do their best work, you're going to fall behind. And a funny image that comes to my mind is actually this idea of a capitalist karma, right? Where technology has made the world more transparent and hyper-connected. And it's actually those same forces that are now coming around and creating the need for tech companies to be more inclusive and responsible citizens.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't hesitate. I guess because I'm an example of diversity at some level. So in my fund that I co-founded, Aspect Ventures, I spent 17 years at DFJ, Draper Fisher Jurvetson, and was a managing partner there before co-founding Aspect Ventures. And I co-founded it with another woman partner from Accel Ventures. And so both of us had a lot of experience, but we really felt like there was an opportunity to start a different kind of firm. And we invest in male and female entrepreneurs. We are gender blind as investors, but we do believe that there's power to diversity from an economic perspective. And there's been a lot of studies and data that have supported this notion that really having a diverse team at the founding team level, at the board level, throughout the executive team really leads to better performance for the companies and better outcomes in terms of their overall growth and trajectory. And there's been, McKinsey's done studies on this. Google has actually done studies to show that even at a team level, teams perform better with diversity on the teams. And it's kind of logical if you think about it, really. What you're talking about on the downside is trying to prevent, if you have people with different perspectives on your team, they see something you won't necessarily see, or you may miss. And they may protect you from missing something, particularly when you have many people selling into customer groups where 50, 60, 70% of those decision makers may be women or minority. You don't want to miss some critical aspect of your product or your service by not having that perspective around the table. And then that's on the downside, but then on the upside, and why we see better performance overall is because different perspectives enable leaders to make better decisions, because it gives them more ideas to think about, more creativity to think about in order to creatively problem solve in a given situation. And so we see that as a competitive advantage to many of our companies, and we have male and female entrepreneurs who come forward to seek that out and to develop their teams that way. And we're seeing those companies really outperform in our portfolio, to be honest. About 60% of our portfolio is male-only entrepreneurs teams from the founding point of view, and then they're trying to diversify. And then we have about 40% that are female-founded teams that are also trying to diversify. And we're trying to drive the understanding of why that matters into our community.
Thanks. I'm talking about, having investors that are diverse. We started on this topic a little bit because of the New York Times piece that came out around Founders for Change. and your pictures in it. And I'm wondering what is it? Maybe tell the audience just a little bit about what it is and why you chose to get involved. I jokingly said that one of your investors is one of the co-founders, but yep. I'm assuming there was more to it than her bugging you to get involved.
A little bit more,
in that.
yeah. So Founders for Change is a group of over 400 founders that have committed to building a more diverse and inclusive tech industry. Specifically, we've publicly stated that we would prefer to work with investment firms that are diverse themselves whenever we have a choice in an investment partner. And other than Jenny Lefcourt, who invited me to join, and I respect incredibly as an investor and human, I was really fascinated by flipping the power dynamic, right? Where traditionally VCs have held more of the power and founders are perceived to be sort of begging or asking for those funds. And when you think about it, it kind of uses supply and demand in a pretty logical way, in that at a macro level, there's probably not enough VC dollars to fund every entrepreneur who has an idea. But at a micro level, the best founders and companies are actually quite in short supply relative to the dollars that want to fund them. And I'm happy to share more, but that was.
I'd also like to hear your personal, we talked a little bit, just your personal story in getting to this place too.
Yeah, I'll share, I'll give you the quick story. First off, I feel like I feel extremely privileged, though I do have an unconventional path to tech. The first part is I actually feel like I immigrated into my own country, because I was born in the US, but my parents moved back to their native Peru when I was a toddler. We then moved back 10 years later, and I got to participate in what I think is a common immigrant experience, and navigating the public school systems and living in a family paycheck to paycheck. And it was interesting for me because I feel like I've developed some amazing strengths from that experience that I bring now to my work. But it also actually, in a funny way, seeded some limiting beliefs that I actually had to unlearn and remove so I could be having the impact that I'm attempting to have now. Well, really quickly on that, early in my career, I was given pretty consistent advice that as a young man of color, I should be working harder than anybody else. And I took it really seriously, and it actually worked really brilliantly for me in my career until it didn't. And I was 26 years old, and I totally burned out. I developed shingles. My immune system was shot because I was so chronically stressed that I just had to go on medical leave and stop everything. So, and I think this is a message that a lot of minorities and women and groups that are not in power are often told, right? That you're expected to put in more than the normal. And I just don't think that's really a sustainable way to approach it. Another key moment for me was actually dropping out of a full-time MBA program at Berkeley, which you teased me about a little bit. When I was considering that decision to found BetterUp, I was giving pretty consistent advice that I should play it safe, play it straight and narrow, don't stand out too much, and don't piss off the employers that they're going to need to pay your bills later down the road. And I do think this is a common dilemma as well for women, for people of color, where you need to be able to take risks and fail if you're going to do something audacious and big, right? On the other end, if you fail, you just prove that the prejudices against you are right. And so how do you navigate that? And I have to say, in my journey, I've had to just sit with that and let those moments sort of help me develop. And I think that's what's allowed me to be in the position where I am today, doing the work that I love to do and doing it in a way that feels consistent with my values and who I am.
It's interesting. I don't know. I'm curious, Jennifer. I've seen quotes. The VC industry hasn't really changed gender-wise, percentage at least, over your whole career, a couple of decades. And so I'm wondering, do you feel some of what Eddie's saying resonates with your experience? And what's holding back change?
Well, I think there's a bunch of factors that are holding back change. Certainly my experience is when I joined the industry, I actually think there were actually more women in the industry than there are today, ironically. I do think that's changing with groups like All Raise and Time's Up Tech and a lot of attention spotlight on the overall issue. I do see venture firms recognizing that their bubbles are actually, frankly, keeping them out of interesting deals. And at the end of the day, our business is a creative, destructive business, meaning that if you aren't finding interesting companies and making interesting investments, and you're not getting access to an entire segment of interesting deals that maybe have a woman founder or may have a minority founder or someone that's coming from a different perspective who chooses not to go to mainstream Sand Hill because they don't think they're going to find like-minded investment partners with them, that changes the entire way the venture business works. Because if they're not getting access to those deals or they're cutting out a large segment of those deals, then their economics and their returns are affected. So we think that, and we're seeing that some of that change is happening. It's sort of a vacillation between fear and greed. Fear of missing out a good opportunity and the greed of wanting to participate in a good opportunity. And so when you have, again, different, whether it be gender-based or minority-based partners in your firm, basically you access different networks and you're accessing a different segment of entrepreneurs or different ideas, or perhaps you look at a particular deal in a different way than a more traditionally trained person might. That's the power of diversity, and that's the power of diverse networks. And so we believe that's, as I mentioned earlier, a competitive advantage for us. But I do see that that's changing, and I applaud it's changing because I think it's really fundamental for our industry, and I actually think it's fundamental for the venture industry to continue to thrive.
Yeah, and then specific, now at the industry level we have this, and now specifically at a company, how do you're the leader, so you get to put in some of these characteristics. So what's going on in BetterUp? How did you infuse this? How do you think about it in the start and as the company is growing?
Yeah, we had the advantage of starting early. So the first thing we did was we committed to being a diverse employer from day one. And we actually treated it as a board mandate, even though we didn't even have a board at the time. And it's been really helpful because we've actually had to push external recruiters, our own hiring managers, at times when they just wanted to hire the obvious candidate. And that's helped us to have a bit of that commitment and backbone to really, frankly, just demand it and demand them to consider diverse candidates in every selection process. The second thing that's worked well for us is actually really focusing our energies and effort on building an inclusive culture and doing that at all levels. So we really care about our every single manager really believing it, right, and really being an inclusive leader. And we hire for that role, we promote for that value, and we also develop it with coaching and with feedback for the managers.
I just want to actually amplify that point because I think that's a critical point around culture. People often dismiss culture, and I'll be honest, when I first started my career, I didn't really think about culture as much. But what we find now is that the companies it's one thing to hire diversity and bring diversity into the company, but it actually doesn't really matter if it's not an environment where a voice is heard or promoted, or people are allowed to be controversial or say something that may be challenging in an environment where that's considered safe and not punishing. And so the culture really plays in a lot of different ways, and it's sort of like, okay, culture, but then what does that mean? And when you break it down, it really comes down to enabling those voices to ask a hard question, challenge the boss, think about things in a way that no one else in the room may think, and then not have them basically shun that person or punish them for them actually bringing that forward. That's a really different type of cultural environment, and yet pretty critical to actually get the value out of diversity. So thinking about how you build culture, it really starts from the day you actually start a company. And it's actually something that you then have to build in as the company scales. You have to actually build it into the processes and into how you build a middle management. I mean, it's actually something that you have to be fairly vigilant about throughout the trajectory of a company.
I love that. Can I jump on that actually?
Go ahead.
It's so good.
Yeah.
I totally believe that. And I think one maybe just a wrong framework that I've seen is treating inclusion as an HR program instead of a business transformation, right? So when you're talking about a business transformation, it needs to be part of management. So the way we do our performance reviews, the way you actually look at what your culture values and punishes in those little interactions. And so I love that. I think that is so often missing in, at least from the things that I see, you see a lot of one and done type of interventions, right? Like, we're going to stop everything and do a one-day training and things will be okay.
Right.
And it's not really embedded.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's how you conduct meetings. It's like, it comes down to every little, and then amplifying a little, when you do something the right way, or someone makes a point of being controversial, thanking them for making that effort or recognizing their courage, because that's the hard part, I think, for people to be courageous in environments where they don't necessarily feel their voice will be heard. But then on the flip side of that, you may find a new way to solve for that. And it may not just be around gender or minority. It could be somebody's introverted versus extroverted. And it's particularly hard for an introvert necessarily to pipe up in a meeting, but they may actually have a really interesting, different way of approaching it. So how do you amplify and compliment them for having that courage?
Love that. Can you talk a little bit, I mean, it already sounds like there's been some changes, like even how we're having the conversation. Do you have a diversity lesson or training versus how it's incorporated in the culture? It seemed like the kind of trajectory of that has changed. Do you see, Jennifer, just the conversation we're having around this is different than when you started? And also, is your participation in it different? I mean, you kind of mentioned like there were more women then. Does it feel different now? Are you getting more activated in, like, what's kind of been some of that?
What's really interesting for me as someone who's been doing this for a couple decades now is it's been really exciting for me to see that sort of next generation of men and women, particularly in their sort of late 20s through their 30s, really embracing and engaging in this type of dialogue in a way that I've just really never seen before. And that energy and interest in having the dialogue and understanding what the underlying drivers are and trying to tease that out and bring that into organizations is really very different from a tenor perspective than what we've experienced. And so I'm very optimistic because of that next generation of men and women recognizing that that's critical. And then coupled with that is the amount of data that's really emerged about how much diversity really does drive performance, and how a wide range of organizations have studied both internally and externally and internally to illustrate that. So data coupled with this dialogue, I think, is really powerful.
That's great. Is there anything, this for both of you, is there anything you feel like we're not talking about yet, or that still is kind of needs to come into this conversation around it? I mean, in general, not this one.
I have one emerging, potentially, hypothesis here, which is this maybe is a little more specific within the topic of diversity, but when I talk to a lot of men in the industry about what's going on with the Me Too movement in particular, I still get a general attitude of mostly innocence, right? Of like, oh my gosh, those bad apples over there in that company, with that whatnot. And I actually think that's a little bit harmful. Right? Because the reality is this is an issue that's been created over generations, decades. It's really embedded, and it requires a lot of awareness and a lot of curiosity for us to solve it. And I do think that that needs to change, right? That sense that we're innocent, somebody else is a bad apple. Because when we put ourselves in that position, you can't actually do anything about it because you're just in it, you're fine, right? So we need to, I think, move to a place where we can have those conversations from the point of view of responsibility. How do we contribute? How are we contributing now? And what can we do to learn and listen to be a little bit better every day so one day we can see substantial change?
Well, and I think I think men and women and people in general have unconscious behaviors and unconscious biases. And I think the challenge for a lot of the #MeToo movement is that there's been very much of the, well, oh my gosh, like you said, it's not really here, but in fact, really, it's in every meeting, it's in every conversation. There's some unconscious bias of some kind, that the women experience too. I actually, when I started speaking about diversity, I had a friend that I grew up with reach out to me and say, oh my gosh, I sit in meetings and I look at the men when they speak, and rather than the woman in the room, because I've been raised to believe that the male figure, even if he's relatively junior, is somehow the dominant force. I have this unconscious bias that I'm behaving. And so it's really interesting just for every person, rather than looking and sort of externally to just take a moment to reflect, well, what am I doing that's a little different? Or what are my assumptions that I'm making in this meeting or in my interactions? That's a really hard conversation to have with yourself, but we all do it. Like, none of us are perfect in that respect. And so having that sort of level of self-awareness and constantly having that dialogue, I think would be super powerful for making change.
Is there anything that you feel you had to kind of overcome? Like, can you talk about like a personal experience with like that? You mentioned the friend, but also like, is there any time where like you've been in and you're like, oh, this person, they're not listening, they're not, or like I'm having to like fight to get to this place, or just like an experience that you, maybe in reflection, because sometimes it's not till someone asks the question. And I thought when the elephant in the room came out stuff that Trey Vasala was leading, I was like, oh yeah, that happened to me, but I kind of forgot because I just like, that's just what happens, guys say that, or, you just kind of, anything that's kind of memorable that stuck out, or?
I mean, I used to have all kinds of small things when I was early in my career. Like, I worked for a consulting firm, and there was always that last-minute rush to get the slides together. And in the old days, we used to have a very archaic kind of software you had to learn to be able to do these sort of intricate slides. And I used to always say, it'd be 11 o'clock at night, and all the guys wanted to go home, and they would look at me or there's another woman on the team, and be like, hey, you guys, I'm sure you know how to use the slides, almost like we were the secretaries of the group, even though we were professionals. And I would always sort of say, I don't actually know how to use that software. Maybe you should, if you know how to do it, it would be much faster if you did it. And so I would essentially not acknowledge that I understood how to use the software in order to avoid being pigeonholed as a secretary in a professional environment. And I'd have similar experiences when I was working in a firm where you had the reception area, and I'd walk through the reception area, and inevitably a visitor would grab me because I was a woman, and assume I was the receptionist, and sort of tell me who they were and what their meeting was and why, and I'd have to sort of redirect them. So you have these like small little impacts. There's probably many larger ones too, but it's interesting to sort of see how those things kind of add up in terms of your self-perception and your need to push back on those and to actively push back in order to be able to do your other work, or have the time to sleep, or whatever it is that you kind of need to do to find balance in your work and in your lifestyle, and have the self-confidence to be able to carry forward.
That really resonates with me. I actually don't think there's any obvious moments where I felt totally at a disadvantage or discriminated. I do think there's these sort of small reminders that, for me, a funny one is actually when we had started the company about 9 months in, we still had not been able to raise any money. And so I was out of savings, so I was driving for Postmates, delivering burritos and a varietal of Mexican treats to people after hours. And I remember just, I would park my Honda Civic, and like people would like wave me down and be like, oh, there's a delivery guy, there's like a young Latino guy in a Civic. Like, I would almost feel welcome. And then during the day, I was pitching VCs, at Starbucks and at different coffee shops. And I would have to, most of the pitch was explaining why I was like an entrepreneur in tech. And it actually wasn't about the business. It was I was like, wow, I'm really having to perfect here. Like, what's my role, and how are we going to hire the next person, et cetera. So it was just a reminder of sort of the biases that everybody brings to the world.
There's so much happening right now. I want to kind of end on like, what are you most excited about in this conversation? What's kind of like taking you to continue working on this issue in your company and your firm, all the momentum that's built up? What kind of gives you hope, I guess, that we won't be here in 20 years saying, no, has anything changed, have numbers changed?
Well, I can start. I take a lot of hope actually in the Founders for Change movement and the folks I've met. The founders I know from the group are all tenacious, driven, scrappy, agile, exactly the kind of people you would want to take on this kind of hairy problem. So and I'm just encouraged to see that this group is really trying to build good companies, not just valuable ones.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm super excited actually about everything from Founders for Change and just the in general energy, as I was saying earlier, around trying to really change the equation. And I personally just think that diversity really does lead to better economics and better outcomes. And so I'm excited for our firm. I'm excited for other organizations that start to recognize that. I actually believe that's right now it's an unfair competitive advantage for those who take advantage of that now, to really drive better performance for their people and for their organizations. So I think there's a lot of smart people out there, and when they see that kind of opportunity, they run towards it. And so that gives me a lot of optimism.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.